The stars had always promised wonder and discovery, but when they finally answered humanity's call, they brought only chains and fire. The galactic hegemony arrived at Earth on a Tuesday morning, and 11 days later, the war was over before most humans even understood it had begun. The Volanthi were not cruel by their own standards. They were simply efficient, cataloging Earth as Territory 7291 and its inhabitants as a Tier 7 species suitable for manual labor and little else. Humans were small, fragile, short-lived creatures with soft skin and brittle bones. And the hegemony had conquered 10,000 worlds filled with species far more impressive. 3 years passed under alien rule, and humanity learned to survive in the cracks of an empire that barely noticed them. Some worked the mines on distant colony worlds. Others served in the great houses of Volanthi nobles, and a few simply disappeared into the vast machinery of galactic commerce, forgotten and unmourned on the mining colony of Kareth 9. In a deep shaft that had not seen natural light in decades, a 17-year-old girl named Myra Vasquez swung her pickaxe into rock that sparkled with rare minerals. Her arms burned and her lungs ached from the thin recycled air. But she did not stop, because stopping meant punishment. And punishment on Kareth 9 often meant death. Myra was small even by human standards. Standing barely 5 feet tall with dark hair, she kept tied back and eyes the color of coffee that had gone cold. There was nothing remarkable about her, nothing that would make anyone look twice. And that was exactly how she preferred it, because remarkable people attracted attention. And attention from the Volanthi was never a good thing. Her mother Elena worked beside her, a woman whose beauty had faded under years of hard labor, but whose spirit remained unbroken. Elena hummed old Earth songs while she worked, melodies from a world Mira could barely remember. And those songs were the only inheritance she could still give her daughter. The Volanthi overseers walked among the human workers like gods among insects, their massive forms casting long shadows in the artificial light. They stood 8 feet tall, with bodies covered in bioorganic carapace that shifted colors with their moods, and their forearms ended in hands that could crush rock or wield weapons with equal ease. Their eyes saw in spectrums humans could not imagine, and their reflexes operated at speeds that made human movement seem like slow motion. Commander Thurak Velkassis ruled Kareth 9 with the casual indifference of someone who had never known defeat. He had commanded 12 colonial operations and crushed 16 rebellions, and humans were simply the latest in a long line of species who needed to learn their place. He did not hate them because hatred required acknowledgement of worth, and he saw no worth in creatures so obviously inferior. The trouble began on an ordinary day when Section Chief Morath ordered the human workers to enter Shaft 7 Delta, a tunnel that groaned and shifted with every step. Its support beams cracked, and its walls weeping moisture that suggested imminent collapse. The humans looked at each other with fear in their eyes, because they all knew what entering that shaft meant. A man named Torres, who had once been an engineer on Earth, stepped forward and spoke the words. That would change everything when he said that the shaft was not safe, and that sending workers inside would kill them all. Morths. Carapace flushed red with anger because no Tier 7 creature had ever refused a direct order in his presence. He struck Torres with a backhand that sent the man crashing into the wall, and then he gave the order again. But this time nobody moved because Torres had given them courage. They did not know they had Commander Theric arrived within the hour, his presence filling the corridor like a thundercloud. He looked at the defiant humans with something between amusement and irritation. And then he made a decision that he believed would solve the problem forever. 10 humans would be executed publicly as an example to the others. Torres would be first, and the selection of the remaining 9 would be random to remind the workers that defiance endangered everyone, not just the defiant. The lottery chose miners and technicians, young and old, men and women. And among the 9 names called was Elena Vasquez. Mira stood in the crowd as the condemned were dragged to the central plaza, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Her mother looked back at her with eyes that held no fear, only love and a desperate silent plea for her daughter to stay hidden and stay safe. The HFY warriors assembled in formation, their ceremonial blades gleaming under the harsh colony lights. These were not ordinary soldiers, but elite killers who had ended rebellions on a dozen worlds. And they treated the upcoming executions as barely worth their attention because killing humans required no skill at all. Thurek raised his hand to give the final order, and the crowd fell silent except for the quiet weeping of those who would lose someone they loved. Mira watched her mother kneel before the executioner, watched the blade rise into the air, and something deep inside her chest began to stir. It started as a cold sensation, like ice forming in her heart, but then it changed into something else entirely. It was heat and pressure, and a feeling she had no name for, something ancient and powerful that had slept in her blood since before her species had learned to walk upright. Her hands began to shake, not from fear or grief, but from something far more dangerous. The feeling grew stronger with every heartbeat, and Myra realized she was no longer afraid. She looked at the Volanti warriors with their massive bodies and deadly weapons, and for the first time in her life, she did not see God standing before her. She saw obstacles before she understood what she was doing, before her mind could catch up with her body. Mira Vasquez pushed through the crowd and stepped into the open space of the plaza where every eye could see her. The HFY warriors turned to look at this small interruption, and Commander Thurek frowned at the tiny creature who dared to step forward. Mira opened her mouth and spoke 2 words that would echo through history, words from an ancient Volanthi tradition that she had learned from whispered stories among the workers, words that no human had ever dared to speak before. "I invoke Cathalar," she said, and the entire plaza went silent as death itself. The words hung in the air like a physical force, and for a long moment nobody moved or spoke. Cathalar was sacred to the Volanthi, an ancient rite dating back to their earliest days as a spacefaring species. And hearing it from the mouth of a human was like watching an insect recite poetry. Commander Thurek stared at the small girl who stood before him, trying to understand what he was seeing. She was covered in mine dust from head to toe. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and she barely reached his chest even though he was seated on his command throne. This creature, this insignificant thing, had just invoked the right of combat challenge against his judgment. The Cathalar was simple in concept, but terrifying in practice. Any being could challenge a ruling or judgment through single combat, and if they won, the judgment was reversed. It was meant to demonstrate Volanthi superiority, to show lesser species the foolishness of questioning their betters, and in 10,000 years of galactic rule, no challenger from a conquered species had ever survived. Thurek began to laugh, a deep grinding sound that reminded Myra of stones being crushed together. Other Volanthi joined him, their alien voices creating a chorus of mockery that echoed across the plaza. And even the HFY warriors allowed themselves expressions of amusement at this ridiculous display. "Do you understand what you ask, little Earth creature?" Thurek said when his laughter faded, leaning forward on his throne to study Myra more closely. "You challenge my judgment with your own body as the stake. You offer your life against a HFY warrior who has killed more beings than you have drawn breaths. Is this truly what you want?" Mira did not look away from his massive alien eyes. She could feel her mother's gaze burning into her back, could hear her whispered pleas to stop this madness and return to the crowd. But she could not turn back because turning back meant watching her mother die. "I understand," Myra said, and her voice did not shake even though her heart was racing like a wild animal trapped in her chest. Thurek studied her for another long moment. searching for signs of madness or desperation. He found neither, only a strange calm that made no sense for a creature facing certain death. Finally, he shrugged his massive shoulders and gestured to his warriors. "Bring forth Kessex," he commanded, and the crowd parted to allow the greatest of the HFY to enter the plaza. Kessex was a legend among the Volanti warrior caste, a being who had devoted 3 centuries to the perfection of combat. He stood 9 feet tall, larger even than most of his own kind, and his bioorganic carapace had been reinforced with rare minerals that made it nearly impervious to damage. His forearms ended in retractable bone blades that could extend to 2 feet in length. Edges so sharp they could slice through starship hull plating like paper. He walked into the plaza with the easy confidence of a predator who had never known fear. His service record included over 300 confirmed kills in single combat. Warriors from a dozen different species who had thought themselves champions. And not one of them had lasted more than 30 seconds against his blades when Kessex saw his opponent. He stopped and turned to Commander Thurick with confusion evident in his posture. "This is the challenger?" he asked, his voice resonating with harmonics that humans could feel in their bones. "This small thing?" "She invoked Kethalor," Thurick replied with another laugh. "Perhaps she wishes for a quick death rather than watching her mother die first. Either way, make it entertaining for us. These humans have been boring lately, and I could use some amusement." Kessex turned back to Myra and tilted his head, studying her the way a scientist might study a particularly unusual insect. "I will try to make it last," he said, extending his bone blades with a sound like swords being drawn. "But I make no promises. Your kind breaks so easily." The crowd was pushed back to form a circular arena, 50 feet across, with the condemned humans still kneeling at its edge. Elena Vasquez was screaming now, begging her daughter to withdraw the challenge, promising that dying was acceptable if it meant Mira would live. But the HFY guards held her in place and forced her to watch. Mira stood in the center of the arena, empty-handed and alone. She had no weapons, no armor, no training in combat beyond the basic self-defense her father had taught her before he died in the initial invasion. She had nothing but the strange fire burning in her chest, growing hotter with every passing second. The other humans in the crowd could not look away even though they wanted to. They had seen what HFY warriors could do to human bodies, and witnessed the aftermath of suppressions and punishments, and they knew exactly how this would end. Some wept silently for the brave, stupid girl who had thrown her life away for nothing. A Volanti official stepped forward to recite the ancient words of the Cathala ceremony. He spoke of honor and combat, of the right to challenge and the duty to accept, of how the outcome would be judged by strength alone. The words meant nothing to Myra, who could only focus on the massive warrior, standing 20 feet away with death gleaming in his 4 extended blades. When the tone sounds, combat begins and continues until one participant yields or dies, the official concluded, stepping back to the edge of the arena. There are no rules except victory. There is no mercy except what the victor chooses to grant. Let the challenge commence. A deep tone rang out across the plaza, a sound that vibrated in the air and signaled the beginning of the end. Kessex did not wait even a fraction of a second before he moved, exploding forward with all the speed and power of 3 centuries of training to human eyes. He simply disappeared from where he stood and reappeared directly in front of Myra, his 4 blades already descending in a pattern designed to remove her arms and legs before finally taking her head. The attack was beautiful in its efficiency, a masterwork of violence perfected over countless battles. His blades cut through empty air where Myra Vasquez had been standing, and Kessex found himself stumbling forward into nothing as his momentum carried him past a target that was no longer there. He spun around in confusion and found the human girl standing calmly 3 feet to his left, exactly where she had been before his attack. Except somehow she had not been there when his blades passed through that space. She was watching him with an expression he could not read, her dark eyes reflecting the arena lights like deep pools of still water. "How?" Kessex began. But then he stopped himself because warriors did not ask questions. Warriors simply killed. He attacked again, faster this time, committing all four arms to a whirlwind of strikes that covered every possible angle of escape. His blades moved so quickly, they created a visible distortion in the air, a sphere of death that nothing could pass through unscathed. Mira tilted her head slightly to the left, and every blade missed her by inches. The crowd began to murmur because even the Volanthi observers, whose visual processing operated at speeds far beyond human capability, had not seen her move. She was simply not where the blades were, as if reality itself had agreed to rearrange around her. Commander Theric leaned forward on his throne, his amusement fading into something that might have been concern. His bioscanners were registering strange readings from the human girl, energy patterns that matched nothing in 10,000 years of hegemony records in the arena. Kessex attacked again and again, his legendary skills failing him for the first time in 3 centuries of combat. And Mira Vasquez simply watched him, her eyes tracking his movements with a focus that seemed almost inhuman, learning and studying and waiting for something only she could feel approaching. 6 minutes had passed since the combat began, and the arena had become a nightmare of carved stone and shattered ground. Kessex had unleashed techniques passed down through warrior lineages spanning millennia, strikes that had felled champions of 100 species, attacks that could bisect armored vehicles and pierce bunker walls. Not one of them had touched the human girl. Myra moved through the storm of blades like water flowing around stones, her body bending and shifting in ways that seemed impossible for a creature of flesh and bone. She never ran, never retreated, never even showed signs of effort. She simply was not where the attacks landed, as if she existed in a slightly different version of reality where Kessex's weapons could not reach the Volanthi. Crowd had fallen, completely silent because they were watching something that should not be possible. Their eyes could process visual information at 400 frames per second, fast enough to track bullets in flight, and yet none of them could see the human girl move. One moment she was in the path of certain death, and the next moment she was somewhere else. With no transition between the two states, Commander Theric had risen from his throne, his carapace shifting through colors that indicated deep disturbance. The bioscanners were going haywire, detecting energy signatures from the human that fluctuated wildly between normal readings and something completely off the charts. He sent urgent queries to the orbiting warships, ordering them to train their weapons on the colony just in case in the arena. Kessex was beginning to feel something he had not experienced in 300 years of combat. His muscles burned with exhaustion, his biocarapace vented heat in desperate pulses, and his attacks grew slower and less precise with every passing moment. But worse than the physical fatigue was the creeping sensation in his mind, the terrible growing certainty that he was going to lose. The human girl had not attacked him once. She had not even raised her hands in defense. She simply watched him with those dark, calm eyes, studying his movements like a student observing a teacher, and somehow that was more terrifying than any counterattack could have been. "What are you?" Kessex demanded, his voice ragged with exertion as he paused to gather his strength. No human can move like this. No Tier 7 species has ever shown such abilities. "What are you?" Mira did not answer with words. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and continued to watch him. And Kessex felt a chill run down his spine despite the heat venting from his carapace. He attacked again because attacking was all he knew how to do, throwing himself forward in a desperate final assault that used every technique he had ever learned. His blades wove patterns in the air that had no names, combinations of strikes that he created on the spot. Anything and everything that might finally connect with this impossible target. The arena floor was torn apart beneath his feet. Great gouges carved into stone by the force of his missed attacks. The air screamed with displaced energy as his blades cut through space fast enough to create small sonic booms. Observers on the edge of the arena had to shield their eyes from flying debris, and through it all, Mayra Vasquez danced untouched. Her movements so subtle and precise that she seemed to be standing still while the world rearranged itself around her. She passed between strikes that came within millimeters of her skin, her clothes rippling in the wind of near misses. But not a single blade drew blood. The human workers in the crowd began to whisper among themselves because they were witnessing something that went beyond survival. This was not luck, and it was not skill as they understood it. This was something else entirely, something that made them remember old stories from Earth about saints and heroes who could perform miraculous. Keswick finally stopped. His forearms hanging limp at his sides, his chest heaving with breaths that could not supply enough oxygen to his exhausted muscles. He had never felt so tired in his entire long life, and he had never felt so afraid. Looking at the small human girl standing calmly before him, he understood with horrible clarity that he had been playing a game whose rules he did not understand. "You could have killed me at any time," he said. And it was not a question, but a statement of fact that he had finally accepted. "You were never in danger. You were studying me." Mayra's expression did not change, but something flickered in her dark eyes, something that might have been confirmation or might have been anticipation. The fire in her chest had grown into inferno now, burning through her veins and filling her muscles with strength she had never imagined possible. Commander Thyrex stepped forward to the edge of the arena, his carapace now a deep angry red that signaled maximum alert. "Keswick, finish this now," he commanded. "I do not care how. Use your implants, your emergency protocols, anything. Kill this creature immediately." Keswick nodded and triggered the combat implants buried in his nervous system, flooding his body with synthetic hormones and stimulants that pushed his physical capabilities beyond their normal limits. The pain was immense. These implants were designed for use against enemy warships, not individual combatants, but he no longer cared about the damage they would cause to his body. His blades began to glow with contained energy as his muscles swelled with artificial power. He became faster, stronger, more deadly than he had ever been before, a living weapon capable of cutting through anything in existence. This was the final form of a HFY warrior, the ultimate expression of Volanthi martial supremacy. Keswick screamed a war cry that shattered windows throughout the plaza and launched himself at Mayra one final time, his glowing blades creating trails of light that painted the air in colors no human eye could properly see. This was death incarnate. This was the end of all things. This was 3 centuries of experience and training and genetic perfection focused into a single devastating assault. Mayra raised one hand. The impact created a shockwave that knocked every observer to the ground, Volanthi and human alike. When the dust cleared and people began to rise, they saw something that would haunt their memories for the rest of their lives. Mayra Vasquez stood exactly where she had been, completely unharmed, with her small human hand wrapped around the glowing blade that had been aimed at her heart. She held the weapon that could cut through starship armor as easily as a mother might hold the hand of a child. And Keswick could not pull it free no matter how hard he struggled. For the first time in 300 years, the greatest warrior of the Volanthi hegemony looked into the eyes of an opponent and saw his own death staring back at him. The human girl's eyes were no longer dark and calm, but blazing with golden light that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul. "My turn," Mayra said, and her voice echoed across the silent plaza with a power that made the very stones tremble. She released the blade, and Keswick stumbled backward, raising all four arms in a defensive posture that suddenly seemed pathetic and inadequate. He knew with absolute certainty that nothing he could do would save him now, that he had awakened something that should have been left sleeping, that the fight had never been one-sided in the way he had assumed. The condemned humans still knelt at the edge of the arena, but they were no longer weeping. Elena Vasquez stared at her daughter with tears streaming down her face, but they were no longer tears of grief. Something was happening to Mira, something wonderful and terrible and completely impossible. And Elena could feel it echoing in her own blood like a song she had forgotten. She knew Myra stood motionless in the center of the ruined arena, golden light spilling from her eyes and dancing across her skin like flames that did not burn. The fire inside her had reached its peak now, and she understood finally what it meant, what she was becoming, what humanity had always had the potential to Betty Valenti had conquered. Earth with technology and weapons in superior numbers. But they had made a terrible mistake in their calculations. They had measured humanity by what they were, not by what they could become. And now they would learn the price of that error. Myra took a breath, feeling power flow through her body like electricity through a wire, and prepared to show the galaxy what a human being could really do. The arena had become a cathedral of silence, every being present holding their breath as they watched the impossible scene before them. Myra Vasquez stood at the center of the destruction, golden light pouring from her eyes like sunrise, breaking through storm clouds. And the greatest warrior of the Valenti hegemony cowered before her like a child facing a monster from his nightmares. Kessex had backed away until he stood at the very edge of the arena, his forearms raised in a defensive posture that meant nothing against the power radiating from the small human girl. His combat implants were burning out, filling his body with agony that he barely noticed because the fear consumed everything else. 300 years of victories meant nothing now. 300 years of believing himself invincible had been erased in 6 minutes by a creature half his size. "What are you?" he asked again, and this time his voice cracked with desperation. "Humans are Tier 7. Humans are weak. Humans cannot do this. What are you?" Mira began to walk forward, and with each step, the ground cracked beneath her feet as if unable to bear the weight of what she was becoming. The golden light spread across her body now, tracing patterns on her skin that looked almost like circuitry, or perhaps like the branches of a vast tree reaching toward the sky. "My ancestors crawled out of the ocean 400 million years ago," Myra said, her voice carrying across the plaza with harmonics that made Valenti ear membranes vibrate painfully. "They survived 5 mass extinctions that killed almost everything else on our world. They walked out of Africa with nothing but sharpened sticks and conquered every environment on Earth." She took another step forward, and the shockwave knocked debris flying across the arena. Kessex tried to retreat further, but found himself pressed against the wall of spectators who scrambled to get out of his way. They split the atom and touched the face of the moon. Myra continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. "They mapped their own genetic code and built machines that could think. They did all of this in less than 10,000 years. A blink of an eye compared to your ancient empire." Commander Thyrek was screaming orders into his communication device, demanding that the orbital warships open fire on the plaza. But his officers were frozen in shock, and the weapons officers could not bring themselves to press the buttons that would kill thousands of their own people, along with this impossible threat. Mira stopped walking, standing only 10 feet from where Kessex trembled against the crowd. She raised one hand and looked at it as if seeing it for the first time, watching the golden light dance across her fingers like flames made of pure energy. "You made a mistake," she said, turning her burning gaze back to the warrior who had been sent to kill her. "You cataloged us by our technology. You measured us by our weapons. You looked at what we were and decided we were nothing special. The light in her eyes flared brighter, bright enough to cast shadows across the entire plaza. "You never thought to measure what we could become." Myra Vasquez advanced a single step forward. The impact was like nothing anyone present had ever experienced. It was not a physical force, but something deeper. A pressure against minds and souls that made every being in the plaza feel suddenly small and fragile. The ground cracked in a perfect circle around her foot. Fractures spreading outward like a spiderweb of broken stone. Kessex fell to his knees. Not from any injury, but from pure overwhelming terror. His warrior training screamed at him to fight, to die on his feet like the champion he was supposed to be. But his body would not obey because his body understood what his mind refused to accept. 3 years of occupation, Myra said, taking another step that sent another shockwave rippling through the plaza. 3 years of suffering. 3 years of pressure. Do you know what pressure does to carbon, Commander? She turned to look directly at Thyrek, and the Volanthi commander found himself frozen by eyes that blazed like twin suns. He had commanded armies and conquered worlds, but in that moment he felt like nothing more than an insect pinned beneath a magnifying glass. "It makes diamonds," Myra said. And she smiled. The smile was worse than the light, worse than the power, worse than anything else. It was the smile of someone who had discovered a secret that changed everything. The smile of prey that had suddenly realized it was the predator all along. Myra turned back to Kessex and moved. There was no blur of motion this time, no subtle dodge or impossible evasion. She simply appeared in front of him with her fist already swinging, and the blow connected with his bioorganic carapace before he could even register that she had moved. The sound was like thunder and shattering glass combined into a single horrible noise. Kessex's carapace, designed to withstand orbital bombardment, cracked and shattered beneath her small human fist. The force of the impact lifted him off his feet and sent him flying across the arena, his massive body tumbling through the air like a discarded toy. He hit the ground and did not move. His forearms splayed at unnatural angles, his carapace broken open to reveal the soft tissue beneath. The greatest warrior of the Volanthi hegemony, the killer of 300 champions, lay defeated by a single punch from a human girl. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even breathed as they tried to understand what they had just witnessed. The fight that was supposed to be one-sided had ended in seconds, but not in the way anyone had expected. Myra stood over the fallen warrior, golden light still radiating from her body. And when she spoke, her voice reached every ear in the plaza with perfect clarity. "The Kethaler is satisfied. My mother and the other prisoners will be released. This is the judgment of combat." Commander Thurek found his voice at last, his rage overcoming his fear as he screamed orders to his remaining warriors. "Kill her!" he roared, his carapace flushing dark red with fury. "Kill them all. I do not care about traditions or challenges. Wipe out every human on this colony." 30 Keshvar warriors surged forward, their blades extended and their implants activated. They were not as skilled as Kessex had been, but together they represented enough force to destroy a small army, and surely no single being could stand against all of them at once. Myra watched them come with no fear in her burning eyes. She raised one hand and made a simple gesture, almost casual, like someone brushing away an annoying insect. The lead warriors hit an invisible wall and stopped as if they had run into solid stone. They pushed against the barrier with all their strength, their blades scraping uselessly against something they could not see. And no matter how hard they tried, they could not advance a single inch. But Myra was not the only one fighting anymore. Across the arena, other humans began to glow. The old man who worked the refinery felt fire ignite in his chest and golden light spill from his eyes. The young boy who cleaned the barracks gasped as power flooded through his young body. Elena Vasquez, still kneeling among the condemned, threw back her head as the same energy that filled her daughter awakened in her own blood. One by one, humans throughout the crowd began to shine, their bodies becoming conduits for a power that humanity had never known they possessed. Some fell to their knees as the transformation overwhelmed them. Others stood straighter than they had in years as strength they had never imagined possible filled their muscles. Commander Thirak watched in horror as the Tier 7 species he had dismissed as worthless began to rise, their eyes blazing with the same golden light that burned in the girl who had destroyed his champion. "No," he whispered, his voice lost in the growing chaos. "This is not possible. This cannot be happening." But it was happening, and nothing in the galaxy could stop it now. The plaza had become a war zone unlike anything the Volanthi had ever experienced. Their warriors, the legendary HFY, who had never lost a territorial war in recorded history, were being driven back by creatures they had classified as barely more than animals. The impossible had become real, and reality was breaking apart around the Mira stood at the center of the chaos like the eye of a hurricane, directing the newly awakened humans with gestures and glances that somehow conveyed exactly what needed to be done. She had never led anything larger than a mining team, had never trained for combat, had never imagined herself as anything more than another worker in an endless supply of workers. But now power flowed through her like a river that had found its true course. The 30 HFY warriors who had charged forward were scattered across the plaza now, defeated by humans who should not have been able to scratch their carapaces. Old men who could barely lift pickaxes that morning were now tearing through bioorganic armor with their bare hands. Children who had grown up knowing only servitude were moving with speeds that made elite warriors look slow. Elena Vasquez had broken free of her captors the moment the power awakened in her, and now she fought beside her daughter with the same golden fire burning in her eyes. Mother and daughter moved in perfect synchronization, their attacks complementing each other as if they had trained together for years. Instead of discovering their abilities only minutes ago, Commander Thirak retreated toward the communications tower, his remaining guards forming a protective circle around him as they fought desperately against the tide of awakened humans. He managed to establish contact with the orbital fleet and screamed orders to begin bombardment of the colony, willing to sacrifice thousands of Volanthi soldiers if it meant destroying this impossible threat. "Target the central plaza," he roared into his communicator. "Maximum firepower. I do not care about collateral damage. Glass this entire sector now." The response that came back made his blood run cold. The orbital weapons were not responding because humans aboard the ships had begun to awaken as well. Workers in the engine rooms and maintenance crews in the lower decks were rising up with golden light in their eyes, and the Volanthi officers found themselves fighting for control of their own vessels across the colony. In mining shafts and processing plants and barracks and detention centers, more humans awakened with every passing minute. The trigger seemed to be strong emotion, fear or anger or desperate hope, and 3 years of occupation had given humanity plenty of all three. The Volanthi guards found themselves overwhelmed by workers they had beaten and humiliated for years. And revenge had never tasted so sweet. Myra felt the spread of the awakening through some sense she had not possessed before this day. She could feel each new human that ignited with power, could sense their fear and wonder and growing strength. And she understood that what was happening here would not stay contained to Kurath 9. The Volanthi communication networks were carrying reports of similar incidents across a dozen other colony worlds. Humans were awakening everywhere, rising up against their overlords with powers that defied explanation. And the galactic hegemony that had ruled unchallenged for 10,000 years was suddenly facing something it had never encountered before, a species that evolved under pressure. Myra had understood the truth the moment her power awakened. Humanity was not weak, had never been weak, but their true potential had lain dormant in their genes for millions of years, waiting for the right catalyst. The Volanthi conquest had provided exactly the conditions needed to trigger what scientists of the future would call the Wayland. Pressure awakening millennia of evolution had prepared humanity for this moment. Their ancestors had survived ice ages by adapting and changing, had spread across Earth by becoming whatever they needed to be. And somewhere along the way their DNA had developed a capability for rapid forced evolution. Push a human hard enough, make them suffer enough, fill them with enough desperate need to survive, and something incredible would happen. The Volanthi had pushed humanity to the breaking point and discovered too late that humans did not break. They transformed Commander Thirek made one final attempt to escape, fighting his way toward a transport shuttle that could take him to orbit. He was thinking of the greater war now, of warning the hegemony about this new threat, of organizing a proper military response that could crush the human. Rebellion before it spread further. Mara appeared in his path as if she had been waiting there all along, her golden eyes fixed on his terrified face. He raised his weapon and fired, plasma bolts that should have vaporized any organic target. But she walked through the barrage as if the energy were nothing more than warm rain. "You cannot stop what has begun," Myra said, her voice carrying a weight of certainty that crushed the last of his hope. "Every human in your empire will awaken. Every world you have conquered will rise. You thought you had won when you conquered Earth, but you only planted seeds that are now bearing fruit." Thirek fell to his knees, his weapon clattering to the ground beside him. He had commanded fleets and crushed rebellions and ruled over billions. But now he was nothing more than a defeated old soldier, facing a force he could not comprehend. "What will you do with us?" he asked, his voice hollow with despair. Myra considered the question for a long moment, thinking about the 3 years of suffering, the friends who had died in the mines, the families torn apart by the occupation. Part of her wanted revenge, wanted to make the Volanthi feel every moment of pain they had inflicted on her people. But that part was not as strong as she had expected. "We are not like you," she finally said. "We will not enslave you or destroy your civilization. We will not take revenge for what you have done. But we will be free, and we will make sure no species ever suffers under your rule again." The battle for Karath 9 ended as the last Volanthi forces surrendered. The news spread across the communication networks like wildfire, reaching every colony and every ship in the sector. Humans everywhere heard the story of the girl who had taken a single step forward and changed the course of history. And hope ignited in hearts that had forgotten what hope felt like in the weeks that followed. The human ascension spread to every world where humans had been taken. Some Volanthi commanders tried to fight, tried to destroy the awakening humans before they could reach full power, but it was too late. The spark had become a flame, and the flame was becoming an inferno that would sweep across the galaxy. Myra became the first speaker of the Free Human Alliance, not because she sought power, but because the awakened humans needed someone to guide them, to remind them that their new strength did not give them the right to become like their former oppressors. She traveled from world to world, helping newly awakened humans learn to control their abilities and teaching them that power without wisdom was just another form of slavery. Elena served as her advisor and conscience, the mother who kept her daughter grounded, even as that daughter became one of the most powerful beings in known space. Together they built something new, not an empire of conquest, but an alliance of free peoples. Humans and other species who had suffered under Volanthi rule, working together to create a galaxy where strength served justice instead of crushing it years later. Historians would debate exactly what had caused the human ascension. Some believed it was a natural evolutionary leap. Others thought it was something engineered into humanity by an unknown precursor race. and a few insisted it was simply the latest example of humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Myra never cared much about the theories. She knew only that her people had been pushed to the edge of extinction and had discovered something miraculous in themselves. Something that had always been there, waiting to be found on the anniversary of the awakening. She returned to Kareth 9 and stood in the rebuilt plaza where everything had changed. The arena where she had fought Kessex was now a memorial garden, and humans from across the galaxy came to see the place where the fight that had seemed so one-sided had turned into something else. Entirely a young girl approached her, eyes wide with wonder, and asked the question everyone wanted to ask. "Were you scared when you stepped forward?" Mira smiled and knelt down to meet the child's eyes. "I was terrified," she admitted. "But I learned something that day, something I want you to remember. Being brave does not mean not being afraid. Being brave means being afraid and stepping forward anyway." She stood and looked up at the stars, at the galaxy that humans were now free to explore on their own terms. And she thought about how far they had come from the conquered people they had been. The fight had indeed been one-sided, but not in the way the Volanthi had assumed. Humanity had always been stronger than anyone knew, including themselves. They had just needed someone to show them, someone willing to take that single step forward into the unknown. And in the end, that step had changed everything.